Black Lives Matter. We hear it all the time from the Democratic Party, so much so that it even made the themes of the Black Lives Matter movement a key component of its official party platform.
Democrats will fight to end institutional and systemic racism in our society. We'll challenge and dismantle the structures that define lasting racial, economic, political, and social inequity. Democrats will promote racial justice through fair, just, and equitable governing of all public-serving institutions and in the formation of public policy. Democrats support removing the Confederate battle flag from public properties, recognizing that it is a symbol of our nation's racist past and has no place in our present or in our future. We will push for a societal transformation to make it clear that Black Lives Matter and that there is no place for racism in our country.
But do Black lives really matter to Democrats? And have Democrats really been fighting to end institutional and systemic racism in society? Or have they merely used the Black Lives Matter movement to provide them with cover after decades of utterly failing the black lives that they have governed almost without interruption for more than half a century? The Black Lives Matter movement arose in 2014 in response to what it perceived as a spike in extrajudicial killings of unarmed African-American men by police officers.
Prison for the police who kill unjustifiably!
An analysis of police killings of black men from January of 2013 through June of 2016, though, shows that the cities in which the vast majority of these killings occurred were in cities that the Democratic Party has controlled for generations. According to data compiled by the Mapping Police Violence Research Collaborative, there are 67 police or law enforcement departments whose officers have killed 2 or more black men since the beginning of 2013. Just 7 of those departments are in cities with a Republican mayor. 60 are in cities with Democratic mayors, and most of those have had Democratic mayors for decades, indicating that those cities have been dominated by Democratic common councils or other legislative bodies as well. The Chicago Police Department has had by far the most officers who have killed black men since 2013, a whopping 37. Chicago has not had a Republican mayor since 1931. Since the Democratic Party has so thoroughly dominated mayoral races for 85 years, it may be safely assumed that Democrats have also dominated Chicago's Common Council for nearly the past century, especially since the current Common Council has just 1 Republican and 49 Democrats. Chicago was also the location of one of the most notorious police shootings in the past 3 years, the killing of Laquan McDonald on October 20th, 2014.
Chicago police respond to calls of an erratic man with a knife. 6 seconds after exiting a police car, Officer Jason Van Dyke fires, striking Laquan McDonald 16 times.
Jason Van Dyke, the Chicago police officer who shot McDonald, was charged with first-degree murder and official misconduct, but not until dashboard camera footage of the incident was released to the public 13 months afterwards.
17-year-old Laquan McDonald walked down Pulaski. McDonald went to his right. Officer Van Dyke arrived from the left, on scene only seconds when he fires 16 rounds at McDonald in about 14 seconds. And he was about to reload when another officer told him to stop.
A whistleblower revealed almost immediately after the shooting that there was, in fact, a video of it, but the Chicago Police Department steadfastly refused to release that video. Why? Well, just 3 months after the shooting, Democratic Mayor Rahm Emanuel, the former White House chief of staff to President Obama, stood for re-election in a contentious primary.
It's election day in Chicago.
Emails showed that Emanuel's closest aides knew about how serious and how criminal in nature the McDonald shooting was, but Emanuel downplayed it and placated black leaders in the city so well that they campaigned for him over his rival in the general election, Jesus Chuy Garcia.
That Emanuel even has a competitor is a stunning setback for the hard-driving Democratic insider, but his failure to win a majority in the February election, despite vastly outspending his rivals, forced him into a runoff.
Emanuel went on to win re-election in April of 2015 and just days later approved a $5 million settlement to the family of Laquan McDonald. Still, the police department refused to release the video of the shooting until a court finally ordered it to that November.
16 shots! 16 shots! 16 shots!
Once the video was public, there were massive protests in Chicago that forced Emanuel to fire Police Superintendent Gary McCarthy and led to charges that Emanuel knew all along that the shooting of McDonald was a crime, but didn't want the video released because it would have cost him re-election. Garcia certainly thought so, telling the Chicago Tribune that he would have won had the video been released before the election. That video would definitely have changed the political environment, Garcia said. There's just some basic Chicago arithmetic in there. Emanuel wouldn't have received as much votes from the African American community. It isn't rocket science, it's arithmetic. And so yes, this tragic video would have had a profound impact. But it was kept hidden, so it wouldn't. And Garcia said, that's the Chicago way. Of the 35 cities with the most killings of African Americans by police officers in the past 3 years, just 4 have Republican mayors. And of the 31 that have Democratic mayors, just 8 have had a single Republican mayor in the past 15 years. This indicates that in the vast majority of cities that have seen the most police killings of black men and women, Democratic leaders control city councils and Democratic policies have been deeply entrenched for decades. Houston, the city with the 3rd most police killings of African Americans, hasn't had a Republican mayor since 1982. Baltimore, the city with the 4th most, hasn't had a Republican mayor since 1967. Other cities that have had some of the most police killings of black men haven't had a Republican mayor in more than 100 years. Washington, D.C. hasn't had one since 1910. Milwaukee hasn't had one since 1908. Atlanta hasn't had one since 1879. New Orleans hasn't had one since 1873. Memphis has never had a Republican mayor since the city was incorporated in 1827. Of the cities with the most police shootings of black men, it's been an average of 48.05 years since a Republican mayor has last been in office. For an average of 48.05 years, then, Democrats have been in charge of police policy in the cities in which police officers have killed the most African Americans since the beginning of 2013.
Milwaukee police are investigating 2 shootings.
Democrats also control 32 of the 35 cities with America's highest murder rates. According to FBI crime data from 2014, the most recent year for which data is available, St. Louis has the highest homicide rate in the country, with 49.9 murders per 100,000 people. St. Louis hasn't had a Republican mayor since 1949. Since its current board of aldermen does not have a single Republican among its 28 members, and there has not been a Republican president of the board of aldermen since 1975, it may be safely presumed that Democratic crime policies have been in place and deeply entrenched in St. Louis for generations. And what have those generations of monopolistic Democratic rule given the city of St. Louis? Well, for one, the 15th highest homicide rate in the entire world. 4 American cities, in fact, rate among the 50 deadliest on Earth with a population over 300,000: St. Louis, Baltimore, Detroit, and New Orleans. Baltimore, remember, hasn't had a Republican mayor since 1967, and New Orleans hasn't had one since 1873. Detroit hasn't had one since 1962. None of those three cities have a single Republican on their respective city councils, and Detroit has elected just one Republican to its city council in the past 46 years. Detroit also happens to be the city with the single highest percentage of African American residents. According to the 2010 census, the city is 82.7% black. It has also been 100% controlled by the Democratic Party for a half century, leading to unprecedented disaster. In 1960, Detroit was the fifth largest city in America and boasted the single highest per capita income of any city in the country. By 2014, it had racked up an estimated $18 billion in debt and became the largest American city ever to declare bankruptcy. Today, it has the nation's highest poverty rate. 48% of the city's household incomes are below $25,000, and so many people have left the city that there are thousands of abandoned homes. 2/3 of Detroit's population has fled in the past 55 years, and while the decline and outsourcing of the American automotive industry bears some responsibility, the big three of automakers, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, still have a large enough presence in the city that their workforces combined total far more than the entire working-age population of Detroit. The scarcity of jobs hasn't been the problem then. The scarcity of effective government has been. Detroit saw an explosion in violent crime over the past few decades, and the Democrats who controlled City Hall were either too incompetent or corrupt or both to combat it, and really to provide basic municipal services. Schools declined as fast as the roads and public transportation systems, and oppressive regulatory agencies made starting or maintaining a business in Detroit a nightmare. So its residents began waking up and leaving Detroit in droves. In response to this shrinking tax base, Democratic leaders began raising taxes until Detroit's property tax levels were the highest in the nation in 2013. This, of course, led to more middle-income families fleeing the city for either its surrounding suburbs or a new metropolitan area altogether. Most of those who stayed were economically unable to move and also required more public welfare services than the higher-income taxpayers who left. This put an even greater strain on Detroit's finances, while decades of Democrats' fiscal mismanagement and outright corruption made bankruptcy a sad inevitability.
The city, once the jewel of American industry, is now in $18.5 billion in debt.
Just as inevitable were the declines of the 9 other cities with the highest percentage of black populations, cities that have also been under monopolistic Democratic control for decades. Flint, Michigan is in nearly as dire economic straits as is Detroit, and to make matters worse, its drinking water is contaminated with lead. Naturally, Flint last had a Republican mayor in 1975, and its city council has been dominated by Democrats for at least 40 years. Decades of these Democrats' mismanagement of the city's finances led to $30 million in debt by 2002 and a financial emergency that was poorly patched up until Flint was forced into receivership in 2011. The city suddenly needed to save money any way it could, and in April of 2014, Democratic Mayor Dane Walling decided to save $5 million by ending a 50-year water lease agreement with Detroit and instead using water from the Flint River.
Here's the Flint. Here's the Flint. Here.
Walling called it an historic moment, as Flint was returning to its roots by using its own water. He even invited news cameras as he counted down to the switch.
We need a countdown from 3. 3, 2, 1.
This proved to be disastrous, as the water was contaminated with lead.
Melissa Mays says the ominous change in the water was particularly noticeable at bath times.
My youngest would tell me, Mom, it's yellow and it's a filmy, gross, foamy thing, and it would smell like open sewer. But we were being told we're still getting used to the new system. It's safe. It's okay.
But it wasn't okay. Far from it. Flint's tap water was laced with dangerous levels of lead.
On December 15th, 2015, another Democratic mayor, Karen Weaver, declared a citywide health emergency.
According to the EPA, the maximum safe level of lead in drinking water is 0 parts per billion. 5 is the threshold for concern. Flint water has been regularly tested above 100 ppb by a Virginia Tech research team. And in at least one home, the team measured above 13,000. 5,000 is considered toxic waste by the agency.
Eventually, 2 longtime members of Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality and Flint's utilities administrator were charged with crimes related to the scandal. Although the media looked to blame the one Republican who has had anything to do with Flint in the past 4 decades, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, because he appointed the city manager of Flint during its receivership, that emergency manager was, in fact, another Democrat. Lead-contaminated water apparently isn't limited to Flint either, as Philadelphia, Chicago, and Milwaukee have all been flagged for potential problems. All 3 have been run by Democratic mayors since 1952. Jackson, Mississippi, the city with the second highest percentage of African-American residents in the country, a city that hasn't had a Republican mayor since 1949 and hasn't had any meaningful Republican presence in the city council in at least 4 decades, city officials waited a full 6 months in 2015 before disclosing that Jackson's water supply was contaminated by unsafe levels of lead.
This is CNN Breaking News.
And let's get right to the breaking news in Baltimore. Just a little while ago, police announced at least 7 officers have been hurt in attacks by violent and rock-throwing, brick-throwing protesters. Over the past few hours, we've seen police responding with tear gas and pepper spray. They also face what they call a credible threat of violence from the city's gangs.
The city of Baltimore has become a flashpoint in the Black Lives Matter movement. Most recently after the acquittals of every police officer involved in the in-custody death of Freddie Gray in 2015.
The high-profile murder case is coming to a close in Baltimore without any convictions. Gray was a young black man who broke his neck while in police custody.
According to U.S. Census data, Baltimore has the 5th largest percentage of African-American residents in America. It's also America's 6th poorest city, and like Detroit, its long, steady decline has coincided with the rise of monopolistic Democratic Party power. The last Republican mayor of Baltimore left office in 1967. When he did, 75% of the city's population of working-age African-American men had jobs. Now, just 57.5% do, meaning that a staggering 42.5% of Baltimore's black men are unemployed. So what happened? Well, for one, the city elected only Democrats for more than 45 years. Every single one of the 15 members of the Baltimore City Council is a Democrat. 4 of them have been serving for at least 20 years. 2 of them have been serving since the 1970s. Likewise, the city's controller is a Democrat who's been in office for 20 years, and the Democratic sheriff has been in office for more than 25 years. Democrats have also controlled the Baltimore County Executive's office for more than 20 years. Just one Republican has been elected to the position since 1966, and he served just 1 term. The current mayor of Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, is, like Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, one of the most connected Democrats in the country, serving as the secretary of the Democratic National Committee. Her party enjoys unanimous control of city and county government and has for decades, but on that party's watch, Baltimore slid into socioeconomic despair, and black men have been the most greatly impacted. According to a study from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Detroit and Buffalo have the lowest percentage of working-aged black men who are employed, at just 43% and 43.9%, respectively. Like Detroit, Buffalo has not had a Republican mayor since the 1960s, and Democrats have had unanimous control of the city's common council for several decades. And like Detroit, Buffalo has one of the highest poverty rates in the nation. In fact, only Detroit and Cleveland, which has been controlled almost unanimously by Democrats since the late 1980s, have higher rates of children living in poverty than does Buffalo. Not surprisingly, not a single one of the 5 cities with the highest child poverty rates, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, Cincinnati, and Newark, New Jersey, has had a Republican mayor since 1971, and only 3 of the 20 cities with the highest child poverty rates either currently have Republican mayors or have had them in the past 2 decades. Likewise, the cities with the worst performing schools in the nation are overwhelmingly run by Democratic Party monopolies that date back decades. The city of Milwaukee has 3 of the nation's 25 worst performing schools. Only Chicago, a much larger city, has more. Stunningly, Milwaukee has had more socialist mayors than Republican mayors in the past 100 years. The last Republican left office in 1908, and since then, the city has had 3 socialists and 7 Democrats in the mayor's office. While the last socialist left office in 1960, the Democratic Party has dominated city government ever since. Not only does Milwaukee now have the nation's second highest poverty rate, it is also the single most segregated city in America. As hard as it may be to believe, 14 of the nation's most segregated cities have been run by Democrats for years, but Milwaukee stands out since research from its own university, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, found that, quote, no metro area has witnessed more precipitous erosion in the labor market for black males over the past 40 years than has Milwaukee. In other words, 40 years of nearly unanimous Democratic rule in Milwaukee has led to the nation's greatest segregation, second highest poverty rate, and worst labor market for black men. On top of that, it also has America's 5th highest violent crime rate, trailing only Detroit, Memphis, Oakland, and St. Louis, all of which have also been controlled exclusively by the Democratic Party since at least the 1970s. Just 2 of the cities with America's 25 highest violent crime rates have Republican mayors, and the vast majority of those cities have been under Democratic control for several decades. In almost all of them, African Americans are more likely to be the victims of violent crime than any other race. According to FBI statistics, a total of 453,650 black people were the victims of violent crime in 2014, the most recent year for which data is available. That's a rate of 1.4%. And it's quite a bit higher than the 1.1% rate of victimization of both Caucasians and Hispanics. The disparity in rates of falling victim to what the FBI terms serious violent crime, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, is even more pronounced. There were 10.1 serious violent crimes for every 1,000 black people in the U.S. in 2014, compared to just 7.0 for every 1,000 Caucasians and 8.3 for every 1,000 Latinos. Given that the overwhelming majority of African Americans live in larger cities as opposed to smaller suburbs, towns, villages, or more rural areas, it is clear that African Americans are much more likely to become the victims of violent crime in larger cities than anywhere else in America. With very few exceptions, these larger cities have been under nearly unanimous Democratic Party control for decades, yet despite the party's assurances that Black Lives Matter, black people continue to be the most frequent victims of violent crime, and black lives continue to be lost in Democratic-controlled cities. Every one of the cities with the 10 highest murder rates in America have Democratic mayors, and Democratic mayors have served in those cities for an average of 62.1 years. That's an average of 62.1 years to enact Democratic criminal justice policies, and an average of 62.1 years in which they have failed. African Americans are 6 times more likely than Caucasians to be murdered in America, and they are much more likely to be murdered in cities with Democratic Party monopolies than anywhere else in the country. So do Black lives really matter to these Democrats who have governed and failed them for so long? By every conceivable measure, Black lives are worse off in Democrat-controlled cities. Murder rates are higher, violent crime rates are higher, poverty rates are higher, child poverty rates are higher, Black unemployment rates are higher, schools are worse, and populations are more segregated. Black lives are even more likely to be lost in police shootings in Democrat-controlled cities. Yet politicizing police shootings is how the Democratic Party tells the nation that Black lives matter to it, joining a chorus of misinformation that drowns out the truth about the cities that they have run into the ground. If Black lives really mattered in those cities, then why haven't Black lives improved in the decades that Democrats have controlled them?